In the chaos of our modern lives, we find ourselves constantly overwhelmed by noise, the noise of the world, the noise of expectations, and the noise in our own minds. Every day, we chase after success, recognition, and validation. We work tirelessly, explain ourselves at every turn, and strive to prove our worth to those around us. But have you ever stopped for a moment and wondered, is this really the path to happiness and peace? What if, in all our efforts to be seen, to be heard, and to be acknowledged, we're actually moving further away from the contentment we so desperately seek? What if the real secret to fulfillment doesn't lie in the endless chase for validation or the need to explain ourselves to others? What if the key to true inner peace, happiness, and growth lies in something much quieter, much simpler, in silence and in focusing on ourselves? Today, we're going to dive deep into an incredibly powerful yet often overlooked teaching, one that's been at the heart of Zen and Buddhist philosophy for centuries. A teaching that might just hold the key to transforming your life in ways you never thought possible. We're going to explore why silence is not just an absence of sound, but a source of immense strength and personal mastery. I know this might sound a little counterintuitive in a world that thrives on noise, social media, and constant chatter. But imagine for a moment, what would happen if you stopped trying to prove yourself to everyone around you? What if you began to focus on your own growth, your inner peace, and stopped seeking external validation? Could you unlock a deeper, more meaningful version of yourself? Stay tuned, because in today's video, we'll be exploring how Zen teachings and Buddhist wisdom tell us that focusing on ourselves and embracing silence could be the ultimate path to not just personal growth, but true transformation. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by the pressure to impress, to explain, or to constantly seek approval, this video is for you. If you're ready to discover how silence and self-focus could lead you to a place of power and peace, I encourage you to watch until the end. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button if you're excited to explore this transformative path with us. Don't forget to subscribe to Zen Mind Journey for more content like this, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on how silence and self-focus have shaped or could shape your journey. Now, let's begin by exploring the paradox that so many of us live by, and how breaking free from it could be the key to unlocking true peace and fulfillment. Section 1. The paradox of seeking fulfillment. In the fast-paced, achievement-driven world we live in, there's an undeniable pressure to gain recognition from others. We find ourselves constantly striving for the admiration of colleagues, friends, and even strangers, hoping that by doing so, we will feel validated and seen. It's a narrative we're taught from a young age. Success is measured by external markers, degrees, titles, wealth, likes on social media, and the opinions of others. We spend so much of our time trying to prove our worth, explaining our actions, and seeking approval that it becomes second nature. But in this pursuit, we often overlook a critical truth, one that Zen and Buddhist teachings reveal, that the quest for external validation doesn't lead to fulfillment. Instead, it creates a vicious cycle of frustration, disillusionment, and emotional exhaustion. At its core, this paradox is troubling. We chase recognition, thinking that it will bring us happiness, but with every accomplishment or praise we receive, there's often an underlying emptiness. It's almost as if we are trying to fill a hole that can never be fully closed. We achieve what we set out to do, only to realize that the recognition we sought didn't bring the lasting satisfaction we imagined. Instead, we're left feeling hollow, constantly seeking the next acknowledgement or the next success. And the cycle continues, with no real sense of peace or contentment. This external validation might momentarily boost our confidence, but it's fleeting. When we rely on others to validate our worth, we give them power over how we feel about ourselves. Their opinions become the measuring stick by which we determine our own value. But what happens when those external sources of validation disappear or become inconsistent? What happens when the people around us stop recognizing our efforts, or when the spotlight fades away? That's when the emptiness sets in. Without the constant flow of approval, we are left to confront a deep sense of dissatisfaction and loss. In a way, seeking validation from others is like constantly running on a treadmill. No matter how fast we go or how much we achieve, we never seem to get closer to true happiness. We might feel momentarily proud or validated by others' recognition, but once the applause fades, we're back to square one, empty and searching for more. The path that Zen and Buddhist philosophy offer is radically different. Instead of looking outward for validation, we are encouraged to look inward. True fulfillment comes not from proving ourselves to others, but from understanding ourselves, growing internally, and cultivating our own peace. Zen teachings emphasize silence and solitude as paths to self-discovery. By turning our energy inward, we begin to focus on our personal growth rather than on how others perceive us. This shift is powerful because it leads to self-mastery rather than dependence on external circumstances. One of the fundamental teachings in Zen is the idea that true strength comes from self-awareness, not from recognition or applause. When we stop trying to prove ourselves to others, we free ourselves from the constant cycle of seeking validation. We stop waiting for the world to confirm our worth, and instead, we take ownership of our own growth and well-being. It's a quiet, internal revolution. We no longer rely on external factors to determine our happiness, because we understand that happiness and fulfillment are born from within. This shift in focus, from seeking recognition to focusing on self-growth, is a profound one. It requires letting go of the need for constant validation and learning to accept and appreciate who we are, independent of others' opinions. As we begin to focus on our own evolution, we find a deeper sense of peace, one that isn't dependent on the fleeting approval of others. So, why is it that the more we seek validation, the more we often feel empty? Could it be that the constant need for approval distracts us from what really matters, our own personal evolution and inner peace? In seeking others' acknowledgement, we may unknowingly sacrifice our own peace and self-understanding. True fulfillment, as Zen and Buddhist teachings suggest, doesn't lie in others' opinions or external recognition, but in the quiet, patient work of becoming who we are meant to be. This paradox serves as a reminder that the pursuit of external validation is a never-ending chase. Instead of running towards an elusive sense of fulfillment, what if we stopped, turned inward, and began to build the internal strength and peace that can never be taken away? Section 2. The Wisdom of Silence. Silence, often overlooked or misunderstood in today's fast-paced world, holds a place of great importance in Zen and Buddhist philosophy. It's not just the absence of sound. It's an intentional practice, a powerful tool for personal growth and self-awareness. Zen teachings often emphasize the value of silence, and one of the core principles encapsulates this wisdom perfectly. Do not speak unless it improves upon silence. This simple yet profound statement points to a deeper truth, that true wisdom and understanding come from moments of quiet reflection, not from constant noise and chatter. In a world bombarded by distractions, opinions, and constant information overload, silence offers us the rare opportunity to step back and observe without the need for external validation. When we choose to speak less, we give ourselves the space to notice the subtle, often overlooked details of life. We open the door to introspection, which allows us to tune into our true feelings, desires, and thoughts. It's through this inner dialogue, often in solitude and silence, that we gain the clarity needed to grow and evolve. Zen practitioners believe that silence is a mirror, reflecting back our true nature. It's in silence that we find the room to listen, not just to the world around us, but to ourselves. The more we practice silence, the more we begin to understand who we really are, what we truly value, and where we need to grow. This is where real personal transformation occurs, when we stop seeking answers in the noise of the world and start looking within. Silence is often seen as a form of isolation, yet in Zen and Buddhism, it is an active, dynamic state that facilitates growth. By choosing to quiet the external noise, we create space for our minds to settle, allowing us to access a deeper level of insight. The silent observer, someone who speaks little but listens and observes much, becomes attuned to their inner world. This is the key to mastering one's own destiny. They are not swayed by external opinions or the constant chatter of others. Instead, they develop the inner resilience and clarity necessary for true success, both internally and externally. I once had the privilege of meeting a successful entrepreneur who shared an eye-opening experience from the early days of his career. In his quest for success, he was constantly seeking the approval and validation of others. He would tell everyone about his goals, ambitions, and plans, hoping to gain support and admiration. However, despite his efforts, his career seemed to plateau. It wasn't until he realized the value of silence, that is, the power of working quietly and without broadcasting his every move, that things began to change. Once he stopped sharing every detail of his journey and simply focused on his work, his success accelerated. He came to understand that success doesn't come from constantly explaining oneself to others, but from the quiet, disciplined pursuit of personal goals. In that silence, he found the power to grow and succeed without the need for external validation. The lesson here is simple but profound. True strength is not in explaining yourself to others, but in mastering yourself in silence. Silence is not a weakness. It's a tool for growth, a powerful foundation for creating lasting change. When we speak less and observe more, we empower ourselves to make better decisions, foster inner peace, and develop a deeper connection with our own truths. It is in silence that we can truly hear our inner voice, which often gets drowned out in the constant noise of daily life. Why do so many of us resist silence? Why do we feel the need to fill every moment with words or noise? In truth, silence is the space where transformation begins. It's in those quiet moments, when we allow ourselves to simply be, that we begin to understand our desires, our strengths, and our weaknesses. Without the pressure of explaining or defending ourselves, we can just be, and in that state of stillness, we find clarity and growth. So, next time you find yourself eager to speak, pause and ask yourself, is this conversation enhancing my understanding, or is it simply filling the silence? The power of silence lies not in saying nothing, but in the wisdom that arises when we embrace the stillness and turn inward. In a world that's constantly demanding our attention, learning to embrace silence can become a radical act of self-discovery and self-mastery. Section 3. The burden of seeking approval. In today's world, the pressure to seek approval from others is more intense than ever, thanks in large part to the rise of social media. Every post, tweet, or picture we share is often a way to showcase our lives and seek validation from others. We crave likes, comments, and recognition from those around us. But what we don't often realize is that this constant search for external validation is more than just a harmless desire for affirmation. It becomes a heavy burden. The more we chase after the approval of others, the more we relinquish control over our own lives, allowing others' opinions to dictate our self-worth. We become prisoners of their judgments, and the consequences of living this way are profound. At the heart of this is a cycle of never feeling truly satisfied. Each time we seek validation, we momentarily feel gratified when we get it, but soon that gratification fades, and we're left looking for more. It's like trying to fill a cup that has no bottom. We seek affirmation from others, only to realize that it never truly nourishes us. The more we depend on external approval, the less we become connected to our inner self. We lose touch with what truly matters to us, and instead, we focus on pleasing others. This disconnect leaves us feeling empty, unfulfilled, and restless. Zen wisdom teaches us that the mind dependent on external validation is like a leaf blown by the wind, unpredictable, unstable, and always at the mercy of the elements. One moment we might feel praised, and the next criticized. This leaves us in a constant state of emotional fluctuation, never able to find lasting peace. In contrast, Zen teaches that the wise person is like a rock in a river, steadfast, unmoved by the rushing current. This rock is firm in its identity and purpose, unaffected by the opinions and judgments of others. The more we focus on others' opinions, the more we allow ourselves to be swept away by the forces of external validation. We become like that leaf, caught in the wind, reacting to every passing breeze, whether it's a compliment, a criticism, or the latest social media trend. The need to explain ourselves, justify our actions, or seek approval means we're no longer controlling our own lives. We're letting the opinions of others dictate who we are and what we do. A real-life example that perfectly illustrates this comes from a young woman I once knew, who lived almost entirely in pursuit of validation on social media. She would post updates about her life, photos, achievements, and personal moments, hoping for likes and comments. She would check her phone repeatedly, watching the numbers climb, and for a brief moment, she felt important and seen. But no matter how many likes she received, it never seemed to be enough. She was constantly seeking more, never feeling fully satisfied. Over time, this need for approval started to weigh heavily on her, leaving her anxious and stressed. It wasn't until she took a step back, stopped obsessing over others' opinions, and redirected her energy inward that she started to find peace. She realized that her true value did not depend on the approval of strangers, but on her own growth, fulfillment, and inner peace. Once she focused on her personal development, her anxiety eased, and she found true happiness, not in the validation of others, but in her own journey. The lesson here is clear. Stop explaining yourself to people who don't want to understand you. It's easy to fall into the trap of feeling that we need to justify our every move, to gain approval, or to make others see our worth. But the truth is, some people will never understand you, no matter how much you explain. Their perception of you is colored by their own experiences and biases, and no amount of justification will change that. Instead, focus on your path and let your actions speak louder than your words. True strength comes not from seeking approval or trying to convince others of your worth, but from confidently walking your own path, regardless of whether others approve. When you focus on your growth and let your actions reflect your values, you create a foundation of self-respect and inner peace that doesn't depend on external validation. Let go of the burden of constantly explaining yourself and seeking approval. Instead, trust in your own journey and allow your results, your character, and your integrity to speak for themselves. Section 4. The power of non-reaction. One of the core teachings of Zen is the concept of non-reaction, which can be one of the most powerful tools for maintaining inner peace. In a world where emotions often run high and provocation is common, it's natural to feel the urge to react, whether through anger, frustration, or defensiveness. When someone insults us, challenges our beliefs, or criticizes our choices, the immediate instinct is often to retaliate or defend ourselves. However, Zen wisdom teaches us that this knee-jerk reaction is not just unnecessary, but it also compromises our inner stability. Non-reaction, on the other hand, is a form of profound inner strength. It isn't about passivity or indifference, but about choosing to remain in control of our emotional responses. By mastering this skill, we preserve our peace, maintain our emotional equilibrium, and prevent others from having power over us. The practice of non-reaction isn't easy, especially when faced with provocative situations that trigger strong emotional responses. Yet, it is in these moments that the power of non-reaction shines the brightest. When we react immediately, we allow external forces, such as someone's harsh words or an unfair situation, to dictate our emotional state. We give others the power to disturb our inner peace. By not reacting, we reclaim that power. It's not about avoiding conflict, but about choosing not to be disturbed by it. This decision allows us to maintain control over our emotions and actions, preventing external chaos from infiltrating our mental and emotional well-being. A key insight from Zen is that when we don't react, negativity often returns to its source. For example, when we don't engage with an insult or provocation, the person attempting to provoke us will eventually realize that their words have no power over us. This doesn't mean we're indifferent or passive. It means we've chosen to take the higher road and not allow someone else's negativity to drag us into their emotional turmoil. The more we practice non-reaction, the more we protect our energy and preserve our focus, preventing ourselves from being emotionally drained by others' actions or opinions. I once encountered someone who would regularly try to provoke me with negative comments. At first, I would feel the urge to defend myself, to argue back, or to explain my position. However, I realized that engaging with this person only gave them the power to upset me. So, I decided to change my approach. Instead of reacting, I remained silent and focused on maintaining my inner peace. I didn't allow their words to disturb me or cause me to react in anger. Over time, this person stopped trying to provoke me. They could see that their attempts to upset me had no effect. I wasn't drawn into their emotional turmoil. Eventually, they stopped engaging in negative comments altogether, realizing that their words held no power over my peace of mind. This example demonstrates the power of non-reaction in a practical context. By choosing to remain calm and silent, I preserved my own peace, and the provocation lost its power. It's important to recognize that non-reaction doesn't mean avoiding conflict altogether. It means choosing not to let external disturbances control our inner state. We can face challenging situations with a clear mind and a calm demeanor, without being swept away by the emotions of the moment. The power of silence is not about avoiding conflict or hiding from uncomfortable situations. Instead, it's about choosing to remain unmoved by external chaos. By practicing non-reaction, we maintain our control over our emotional responses, and we preserve our inner peace. When we choose not to react, negativity returns to its source, leaving us unshaken. The more we practice non-reaction, the more we cultivate a deep sense of inner strength that is not easily disturbed by the outside world. Non-reaction is one of the most potent practices for maintaining emotional freedom and peace. It allows us to rise above petty conflicts, to avoid unnecessary emotional drain, and to stay focused on what truly matters. By learning to respond thoughtfully, instead of reacting impulsively, we protect our peace and reclaim our power. Section 5. The secret of working in silence. In a world obsessed with social validation, many people believe that sharing their plans with others is a necessary step toward success. They announce their ambitions, discuss their strategies, and seek encouragement, thinking that external validation will keep them motivated. But in reality, talking about goals often creates a false sense of accomplishment, a feeling that something is being achieved when, in fact, no real progress has been made. The more we talk, the more we dissipate our energy into words rather than actions. Psychological research has shown that when we share our goals, our brain often registers it as a step toward achievement, making us feel like we've already accomplished something, even when we haven't. This phenomenon, known as social reality, can trick us into believing that talking about a goal is equivalent to taking action. But success is never built on words. It is forged through consistent, disciplined effort in silence. When we share our goals, we also expose them to external influence, opinions, doubts, and unsolicited advice from others. While feedback can sometimes be valuable, it often dilutes our original vision and introduces unnecessary self-doubt. Some people might discourage us out of jealousy, skepticism, or even well-meaning but misguided concern. The more we let external voices interfere, the more we lose clarity and momentum. This is why those who achieve true mastery and success often choose to work in silence. Instead of seeking validation, they channel all their energy into perfecting their craft, allowing their results to speak for themselves. I once knew an artist who spent years talking about his projects, sharing every idea before even picking up a brush. He believed that by discussing his work, he was keeping himself accountable and attracting potential opportunities. However, despite all the conversations, he struggled to complete his pieces. One day, he decided to stop talking and simply create. He withdrew from social distractions, cut down on discussing his ideas, and poured all his energy into painting. Within a year, his work transformed. His skills improved exponentially, and his portfolio expanded. Without the noise of external opinions, he was free to create authentically, without worrying about how others would perceive his work. The result? His silent dedication led to recognition and success, not because he had promoted his work extensively, but because his art spoke for itself. Galleries started noticing his work, and collectors reached out to him, not because of his words, but because of the undeniable quality of his paintings. A similar lesson comes from a highly successful entrepreneur who built a thriving business without ever announcing his plans publicly. Early in his career, he used to discuss his ideas with friends, colleagues, and mentors, hoping for encouragement. But he noticed that the more he talked, the less motivated he felt to execute. He made a drastic shift. He stopped sharing his strategies and focused purely on execution. He built his company behind the scenes, refining his systems, improving his products, and solving problems without broadcasting his progress. By the time he launched, his work was already at a level of excellence that demanded attention. Investors and clients were drawn to the quality of his execution, not the promises he had made. His philosophy became simple: let the results do the talking. By keeping his work quiet until it was undeniable, he built something truly valuable, free from the influence of premature opinions or unnecessary expectations. Why working in silence works? 1. It prevents energy dissipation. Talking about goals can trick the brain into feeling like progress is being made, reducing the drive to take real action. Silence keeps focus intact, ensuring that energy is directed toward execution, not empty discussion. 2. It eliminates external noise and doubt. Sharing plans invites criticism, skepticism, and unsolicited advice. When working quietly, one can refine ideas without external distractions or unnecessary self-doubt. 3. It strengthens discipline and focus. Without the need to seek validation, individuals develop intrinsic motivation, relying on personal standards rather than external praise. Focused effort over time creates mastery, which naturally attracts recognition. 4. It allows success to speak for itself. Results carry far more weight than promises. Instead of convincing people with words, let actions and achievements be the proof of one's capabilities. The lesson is clear: work in silence. Let your success make the noise. In a world where people are quick to announce their intentions but slow to follow through, those who choose quiet execution gain a powerful advantage. They conserve their energy, shield themselves from distractions, and build something undeniable, allowing their results, not their words, to command respect. So, the next time you feel the urge to announce your plans, pause and ask yourself, do I want validation or do I want real success? If it's the latter, let silence be your ally, and let your work speak louder than any words ever could. Section 6. Focusing on yourself for true mastery. In a world driven by competition and constant comparison, it's easy to fall into the trap of measuring our success against others. Social media, workplace dynamics, and societal expectations all reinforce the idea that we must constantly evaluate our progress in relation to those around us. But this mindset is not only exhausting, it's also counterproductive. When we compare ourselves to others, we shift our focus outward instead of inward. We start chasing external benchmarks, feeling pressured to meet societal definitions of success, rather than working toward authentic personal growth. The result? Frustration, self-doubt, and a perpetual sense of inadequacy. Why comparison is the enemy of growth? One of the biggest problems with comparison is that it places our self-worth in the hands of others. Instead of setting our own goals and defining success on our terms, we allow the achievements of others to dictate how we feel about ourselves. 1. The moving target effect. When we compare ourselves to someone else, we assume their success is the standard we should reach. But success is subjective, and everyone's journey is different. Even if we reach the level of someone we admire, there will always be someone else ahead, leading to an endless cycle of dissatisfaction. 2. Focus on the wrong metrics. Comparison often leads us to measure ourselves using external factors, money, career status, or social validation, rather than internal growth. True success is about mastery, fulfillment, and inner peace, none of which can be accurately measured by looking at someone else's life. 3. Wasted energy and mental drain. Every moment spent obsessing over someone else's progress is a moment lost for personal development. Instead of using mental energy to improve, people caught in comparison waste time feeling envious or discouraged. This is why those who achieve true mastery learn to shift their focus inward. Instead of competing with others, they compete with themselves, striving to be a better version of who they were yesterday. A friend of mine, an aspiring writer, used to struggle with constant self-doubt. He followed other writers on social media, comparing his progress to theirs. If someone else published a book or received recognition, he felt inadequate, questioning whether he was talented enough to succeed. One day, a mentor gave him a piece of advice that changed everything. The only competition that matters is with your past self. Instead of measuring himself against published authors, he began tracking his own progress, focusing on improving his writing, refining his skills, and staying consistent. By shifting his attention from comparison to self-improvement, he made incredible strides. Within 2 years, he completed his first novel and landed a publishing deal, not because he outperformed someone else, but because he dedicated himself to being better than he was yesterday. Psychologists have long studied the effects of comparison, and the results are clear. People who focus on their own improvement experience greater motivation and long-term success. Those who engage in constant comparison are more likely to feel anxious, unfulfilled, and stagnant. One study found that intrinsic motivation, fueled by self-improvement rather than external validation, is the key to high performance in any field. When people set personal goals based on their own values and passions, they are more likely to stay committed and achieve meaningful success. By focusing inward, we cultivate self-mastery, a state in which we refine our skills, deepen our understanding of ourselves, and make meaningful progress without the distractions of external competition. Zen philosophy teaches that the silent observer is the one who masters his own path. He does not compete, compare, or seek validation from others. Instead, he directs all his energy inward, using silence and self-awareness to grow stronger. How to shift from comparison to self-focus. 1. Measure progress by your own standards. Instead of asking, "Am I doing better than others?" ask, "Am I improving compared to who I was yesterday?" 2. Limit exposure to unhealthy comparisons. Social media can be a breeding ground for self-doubt. Be mindful of how much time you spend consuming others' curated successes. 3. Embrace the long-term game. Growth is not about quick wins or keeping up with others. It's about steady, sustainable progress over time. 4. Redirect envy into inspiration. Instead of feeling inferior to someone else's success, ask, "What can I learn from their journey?" 5. Silence the external noise. The best work is done in quiet focus, without seeking approval or worrying about how others perceive our progress. Every moment spent comparing yourself to others is a moment taken away from your own growth. True success is not about outshining someone else. It's about becoming the best version of yourself. The most powerful transformation happens when you turn inward, when you stop chasing validation, when you measure success on your own terms, when you focus on your path, your journey, and your mastery. The journey of the silent observer teaches us one undeniable truth. True strength does not need to be loud. It does not need validation. It does not seek approval. It does not waste energy explaining itself to those who will never understand. True strength is found in self-mastery, quiet confidence, and the unwavering focus on one's own growth. Throughout this journey, we've explored some of the most profound lessons from Zen philosophy. Lessons that have the power to reshape the way we live, work, and think. The paradox of seeking fulfillment. The more we chase validation from others, the emptier we feel. True fulfillment comes from within, not from external approval. The wisdom of silence. In a world full of noise, silence is a rare and powerful tool. It allows us to observe, reflect, and cultivate wisdom. The burden of seeking approval. The moment we stop explaining ourselves to those who don't truly care, we set ourselves free. The power of non-reaction. True mastery is not in how we react, but in how we maintain our inner peace despite external chaos. The secret of working in silence. Talking about goals can create an illusion of progress, but real success comes from quiet, disciplined execution. Focusing on yourself for true mastery. Every moment spent comparing ourselves to others is a moment stolen from our own growth. The only competition that matters is with the person we were yesterday. At the heart of all these lessons is one timeless truth. The path to true power, success, and inner peace begins when you stop looking outward for validation and turn inward for growth. Now that you've heard these lessons, ask yourself, where in your life are you wasting energy explaining yourself to others? How often do you seek approval instead of trusting your own journey? Are you spending more time talking about your goals than actually achieving them? Starting today, I challenge you to embrace the silent path. Stop announcing every plan, just take action. Stop explaining yourself to those who don't matter. Let your success speak for itself. Stop seeking approval. Seek self-mastery instead. You will be amazed at what happens when you reclaim your energy and focus entirely on your own growth. The silent observer does not chase, does not explain, and does not seek validation. They listen, they learn, they grow, and in the process, they become truly powerful, unshakable, and at peace. So the next time you feel the urge to prove yourself, pause. The next time you feel like explaining your choices, hold your ground. The next time you feel the need for external validation, turn inward and remind yourself, I am enough. This is the way of Zen. This is the way of true strength. This is the way of self-mastery. If you found value in this video, I invite you to take this journey further with us. Hit that like button if this message resonated with you. It helps spread the wisdom of Zen to more people. Subscribe to Zen Mind Journey and turn on notifications so you never miss new insights on mastering your mind and life. Drop a comment below and share. What is one thing you will start doing differently after hearing these lessons? I'd love to hear your thoughts and your experiences on this journey towards self-mastery. Thank you for watching. And remember, the strongest person in the room is not the one who speaks the most, but the one who listens, observes, and masters themselves. See you in the next video. Stay mindful, stay powerful,